Better get indoors. The Indianapolis Twisters are on the air. Let the countdown to kickoff begin. And now, with the pregame show, here's the voice of the Twisters, Kenn Tomasch.
Good evening, everybody, and thanks for being a part of Central Indiana sports history tonight. Just about 15 minutes, the Indianapolis Twisters kick off their inaugural season in the Continental Indoor Soccer League here at the Palace of Auburn Hills in suburban Detroit against the Detroit Neon. I'm Kenn Tomasch, and it will be my privilege to bring you the play-by-play account of all 28 regular season and any playoff games the Twisters play this summer. And you can hear it all along with our Monday evening talk show, Twister Watch, right here on AM 1430 WMYS. First, a little history for you. The Continental Indoor Soccer League, the CISL, began in the summer of 1993 with 7 teams, grew to 14 teams in 94, 15 teams a year ago, and 11 clubs will take the field this year. The Twisters are in the CISL's Eastern Division, along with the Dallas Sidekicks, the Houston Hotshots, Washington Warthogs, defending league champ Monterrey La Raza from Mexico, and these Detroit Neon, who they provide the opposition tonight. The Western Division boasts the Anaheim Splash, the Portland Pride, Seattle Sea Dogs, San Diego Sockers, and the Sacramento Knights, who were league runners-up a year ago. This Indianapolis franchise has gone from inception to reality in less than 4 months. It was back on February the 22nd that the CISL awarded the franchise to David and Rodney Goins. Tonight, after coming up with a logo, a staff, and a roster of players, having training camp for a little over a month, it takes the field for the very first time.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Hey, everybody. How are you? It's Tim Hanlon, your congenial and humble host for another episode of Good Seats Still Available, that curious little podcast that is devoted to what used to be in professional sports. Thanks for joining us. And another fun episode as we try to do here on tap for today. We are getting back into indoor soccer and the interesting little nook and cranny of the Continental Indoor Soccer League of the 1990s, known as the CISL, one of the many in the long string of alphabet soup labels and leagues of professional soccer in this country. But a very interesting little detour in it. The mid-90s was an interesting time for American soccer. Not only the CISL indoor soccer played in the summertime in major arenas around the country with a lot of ownership from NBA and NHL owners and the arena owners themselves to do so, but also this was done in the backdrop of the demise of the arguably the progenitor of indoor soccer professionally in this country, the Major Indoor Soccer League, which had whimpered to a death in its death in the early 1990s, and also the rebirth of outdoor soccer, which had sort of lain moribund with the demise of the NASL in the mid-1980s because of course, the 1994 World Cup, a huge global event that brought spotlight to the outdoor game back in this country, and frankly, its glaring absence. And of course, as part of the winning of that bid in 1994 was the guarantee to FIFA that another major professional outdoor league of substance would be born in the wake of the tournament, which it did in Major League Soccer in 1996. But that's for other discussions on other episodes. But today we're going to be talking about the backdrop of that for what is the probably the last major attempt at solid, top-notch professional indoor soccer. That is the Continental Indoor Soccer League, with our guest, Kenn Tomasch, who was the voice of the Indianapolis Twisters, later named the Indiana Twisters, in the last 2 years of that league, 1996 and 1997, and has some very interesting stories about the CISL, its formation, the Indiana/Indianapolis franchise is part of that, and some really interesting discussion points that we'll get to about the CISL with our guest, Kenn Tomasch, in just a couple of seconds. Let's see here. We are promoting, of course, our alliance and our relationship with our friends at Audible. We also remind you, of course, that Audible's audiobook service is good for the heart, good for the soul, good for the ears, and we do encourage you to give it a try. A free month's trial of the Audible service is yours for the taking at audibletrial.com/goodseats. It is there you will get a promotional offering for a free month of Audible's audiobook service, as well as, importantly, a free audiobook download for you to enjoy over that 30-day period. And I trust you will enjoy one of over 180,000 plus titles to choose from in just about every genre that you can imagine. Nonfiction, fiction, you name it, it's there. Sports history, absolutely there too. Give it a try. It's audibletrial.com/goodseats. Please get your free month of the Audible service, as well as a free audiobook download for you to enjoy gratis, free on us. And you can cancel at any time. And it's well worth a try, and we appreciate your doing so. If you've done it already, if you haven't, give it a try. I think you'll enjoy it. Again, audibletrial.com/goodseats, and those free goodies are there for you to enjoy. So thanks for giving them a try. All right, let us not waste any more time. Let us segue smoothly as possible into our conversation with Kenn Tomasch here on The Big Show.
I've always been a sucker for these kind of alternative leagues. I just think they're just remarkably fun. Sometimes they've been ramshackle, and sometimes they've been outstanding. But they've always been interesting, and so I've just always been curious. Kind of like you, kind of have this fascination with teams that don't exist anymore, and what it was like, and all the alternative ways of doing things. And it's just, why did they come into existence in the first place, and why did they go away? These are all interesting things to think about.
Yeah, so let's start there. So why do you think? And then we can obviously get into your background, and then and we'll get into the CISL, which is kind of some of the kernel, I think, of what we maybe emblematic of this. But why do you think there's a fascination there? Maybe this is a personal sub-journey as well, but I'm always curious as to find out why people are similarly interested.
Well, I mean, we all love sports in one way or another anyway, and so the more the better. But I think that there are just so many great stories and so many weird things that happen. I mean, the NFL is kind of, corporate, and you know what you're going to get for the most part. So the established leagues are pretty much, what you're going to get. But in these alternative leagues, really weird things happen. And so the other thing is, I think, is a lot of us, if we didn't grow up in a major city or a team or a city that had, all four major franchises, sometimes we had these teams. I grew up in Tampa, Florida, and we had no basketball, and we had no hockey, and so we had a football team and a soccer team, but we had a CBA team for a while, the Tampa Bay Thrillers, and so that was our team. And so it was just interesting to go and see. And one year they moved right before the playoffs. They moved from Tampa, Florida, to Rapid City, South Dakota. I mean, you're not going to see that in one of the so-called established major leagues. So that's just really, sometimes they're head scratching, but they're always interesting, and we have this emotional connection to them. Maybe because they were so weird, because they were like us. They had their foibles and they had their missteps, and you loved them anyway.
Yeah, I think Tampa is an interesting market, right? Because especially, I think, for fans of this generation, and maybe frankly the embarrassment of riches now that Tampa has as a professional sports town. You go back to even the early '80s, certainly, I guess, definitely the '70s, right, when the Tampa Bay Buccaneers came in the NFL in 1976, and obviously the Tampa Bay Rowdies prior to that. Aside from that, there really wasn't a whole lot of quote unquote professional sports, at least at the top tier level, in the Tampa St. Pete metropolitan area until around that time, right?
Right. When I grew up there, we had two teams basically. We had the Bucs, who were terrible, and the Rowdies, who were great. And I fell in love with both of them pretty early on for different reasons. I was just learning about sports and learning about football, and they went 0-26 to start. I mean, you how could you not feel for them? So I've been 40 years a fan of that team. But the Rowdies were winners, and they were flamboyant, and they had flair, and they had these great personalities, and so that's when I really fell in love with the game of soccer. But the rest rest of the Tampa Bay area, the Lightning didn't come around until 92, so we didn't have hockey. We did have the Florida State League, and I love the Florida State League. So we had the Tampa Tarpons, which was an A-ball Florida State League affiliate of the Cincinnati Reds, and they played at old Al Lopez Field, and my best friend and I used to go to games, so there was that. But seriously, probably the third biggest sport in the Tampa Bay metro area at the time when I was growing up was professional wrestling. I mean, championship wrestling from Florida with, guys like Dusty Rhodes and Ric Flair, guys like that, and their announcer was Gordon Soley, and it was on TV all the time. That was probably the third biggest sport that we had at the time. We didn't have a major college. The University of South Florida, which has football now, didn't then. So we really didn't have much else. And so we would get these weird teams that would crop up, so we had, the Thrillers, like I mentioned, in the CBA, and then there was talk of having a women's basketball team at one point that never happened, and the Rowdies played indoor sometimes, and then there was another indoor soccer team, and there was always talk that maybe there would be a hockey team, but there was no place for them to play, and so we went back and forth with all these little weird offshoot teams, but the ones that endured, the Bucks have been there forever, and now it seems like the Lightning has been there forever, and the Rays have only been there for 20 years. But yeah, when I was growing up, we didn't have a whole lot.
All right, but obviously there was something there in terms of sports and the potential of pursuit professionally to do that, and that led to an interest in a broadcasting career. So maybe you can sort of tie together some of your Rowdies memories with sort of your budding career interests and how that sort of blossomed from there.
Oh, yeah. From the time I was 13, I wanted to be a sportscaster. I wanted to be on Monday Night Football. That didn't happen, but I was fortunate enough to be able to have a broadcasting career for 20-something years. I wanted to do that and went to the University of Florida to study broadcasting and was a local TV sportscaster for several years and did some play-by-play stuff on the side. And as it turned out, it took several years later and bring it back around to the CISL where we were originally headed, that was the first time I got a chance to get behind the microphone and call soccer. And from there, that led to doing outdoor soccer in the lower divisions, to doing Major League Soccer, to doing some international soccer, to doing more indoor soccer. So I was, for a time, able to do a whole bunch of soccer broadcasting. So it was a lot of fun. But yeah, it all really started with this fascination, this love for this team, this Tampa Bay Rowdies team, that was just so able to capture everyone's attention at that point in time for that brief window.
So for those eagle-eyed listeners, or I guess you can't be eagle-eyed and listener, but our episode with David Whitford a number of weeks ago actually stumbled across a league that did come across your radar in your early fledgling career, the Senior Professional Baseball Association. And frankly, for those who are so inclined, either because of that episode or despite it, the only sort of surviving clips that are really out there that you can find on YouTube, with the exception, I think, of a CNN spot with the old Nick Charles and some others, is stuff that you actually produced when you were working at station WINK. I don't want to drag you back to the Senior Professional Baseball Association, but before we go further, any sort of memories of that sort of year and a half of interestingness?
Yeah, that was super fun, too. And if you haven't listened to that episode of the podcast, everyone listening now, I encourage you to go back and listen to that. Yeah, here's where being a pack rat really helps, in that I saved a bunch of stuff. I just saved it, and I don't know what I was going to do with it, but it had been sitting on tapes for years and years, and I've been lugging them around the country. And now with the advent of YouTube and with the technology to be able to digitize those tapes, I thought, well, maybe there's a few people out there who remember this league. Maybe this would be of interest to somebody, but in any case, it needs to be preserved. Because, like you said, there's so little of it out there. So I digitized it and put it up there. That was fun because you talk about growth. I mean, Fort Myers, Florida now has a bunch of sports teams, and there's a bunch of stuff to cover. But when I was there in the late 80s to the very early 90s, we didn't have really much to cover. I mean, from when high school football was in the fall, and then some high school basketball, and there was a single A Florida State League team in the summer, but it was up in Charlotte County. We didn't have anything to cover. So when someone said, hey, we're going to put a professional baseball team in Fort Myers, and it was going to be right down the street from my station where I was working, and you're going to have all these great names in the league that they were talking about, and Raleigh Fingers and Ferguson Jenkins, and those guys were going to play in the league. We were like, hey, this is like getting a major league team for us. And so we covered it like it was a major league team. We went to all the games and covered all the games and did live shots before the games, and just as if we had a major league franchise in town. Now, the populace didn't exactly see it that way, and they didn't respond to it in major league numbers. But I got to meet a lot of cool people and had a lot of fun covering the games, and got to see some of the guys who I had grown up watching play, and then to get them when they were in a little different place in their lives. As David Whitford said on your podcast, they were a little different. They weren't playing to be stars. They were playing just because they loved to play, and they all had those great stories. And I found out a lot of them were really cool guys to be around at that stage in their lives. So it was a fun while, but it was a mess because however well-intentioned it was, they really didn't know what they were doing. They overestimated the market, and like you saw, it collapsed halfway through the second year, which was unfortunate. But I still have a Fort Myers Sun Sox cap here somewhere that I got just as they were folding. So that little piece of memorabilia sticks around.
Well, there you go. So that is for you completists out there. That is our little episode number 30 with author David Whitford, who wrote a book about basically the first year of the existence of that league. We encourage you to check it out. And I think maybe this is how Ken and I actually got connected in some way, shape, or form. Okay, so let's maybe the torturous journey perhaps to Indianapolis, but maybe we can sort of maybe wend our way towards this thing called the Continental Indoor Soccer League. I suspect that prior to having this opportunity presented to you, you were obviously active in sports and sports broadcasting and had a bunch of things ongoing. I think from my research, you were also either at the time or prior doing minor league hockey in Indianapolis, but maybe a little bit of a background as to how you got to Indy in the first place, and then we can sort of stumble into this world of the CISL that you've somehow found yourself entrenched in for the last 2 years of its existence.
Sure. So I was in Fort Myers working at Wink TV, and your objective at that stage of your life when you're in what was a small market at the time is to get to a larger market. So I was putting out resumes. I had an agent getting me, trying to find me jobs on my behalf, and found this job at the ABC station in Indianapolis. So my wife and I moved to Indianapolis in 1992. I went to work at the television station there doing sports, and then in the summer of 1993, I was just having a conversation with the guy who was doing the play-by-play for the Indianapolis Ice, which was an IHL team at the time. And I hope you do a show on the IHL if you haven't, because that was a great league too. And he just mentioned that he wouldn't be able to do it that fall because he had a bunch of basketball commitments. And I said, well, have they gotten anybody to replace you? He said, I don't know. So I knew the Ice. We covered them. So I called up their president, Ray Compton, and suggested myself. And I had no hockey experience at that time because growing up in Florida, I had rarely seen. My experience with hockey at the time had been Dan Kelly on the USA Network calling the finals when the finals were on. So that was about it. But so I said, well, this would be a fun challenge. This would be fun to do, to be the voice of a team for a year. So yeah, in 93, 94, I was the radio voice of the Indianapolis Ice. We had a very bad team, had a really good bunch of characters, and Dwayne Sutter, one of the famous 6 Sutter brothers, was the head coach, so he was a lot of fun. So it was a great experience being the voice of the Ice. But so fast forward a couple of years, I hear they're going to announce a soccer team, a professional indoor soccer team for Indianapolis. I'm thinking, well, there's a chance. I mean, there's certainly nobody in this town who's done indoor soccer play-by-play, including yours truly. So all I had was a tape of me doing hockey. So after the press conference, I covered the press conference. I was still working at the TV station at the time. I went up to the owner and I said, I want to do play-by-play for you. Here's a tape. And that was in February of 96. And over the course of the next few months, eventually, I guess, somehow they decided that the only option they had was this guy. It was me. So that's how I fell into the CISL in 1996 in Indianapolis.
So what did you know of the Continental Indoor Soccer League prior to that? And obviously you had a very limited play-by-play general. Say again?
I think a lot of people had no idea. I mean, so it had been around 93, 94, 95. The first time we heard, I think, the story broke in the paper, hey, there's going to be a press conference in a couple of days, and they're going to put a team in this thing called the Continental Indoor Soccer League. That was probably the first time most people had ever heard of it, at least in Indianapolis. I had no idea it existed. We didn't have a team. I mean, by the time of having gone through the '95 season, they had 15 teams, but they'd compressed down. They'd lost a couple of teams, and I knew some of the names. I mean, I knew the San Diego Soccer's name. I knew the Dallas Sidekicks' name, but it was a different time, and I had no idea that the league even existed. So it was a brand new thing for me. But I was thinking, here's a chance to do something I've always wanted to do, which is play-by-play. And having done it for a season with a hockey team, I thought, well, this would be fun too, do a season of indoor soccer if I could get the gig.
Yeah, it's interesting because the league, itself was born sort of out of the ashes of the old Major Indoor Soccer League, the original one. And for the last 2 years of its existence was known as Major Soccer League, which was, I think, sort of an attempt to kind of clunkily try to bridge into some outdoor and indoor stuff together and sort of harmonize across a yearly schedule, all that kind of stuff. And yet, here you have sort of the rebirth of indoor soccer after all that sort of that stumbling and demise in the early 90s. You had a bunch of arena owners sort of ring-led by Jerry Buss and Ron Weinstein, of the LA Lakers and MISL LA Lasers fame, basically saying, hey, you know what? This idea actually is not maybe bad. It's probably just bad being directly competitive with the NHL and the NBA during the winter months. How about during the summer?
Yeah, and Ron Weinstein obviously worked for Jerry Buss, and he had this idea, I'm sure Dr. Buss owned the Forum at the time. It was like, hey, how do we fill some dates? Here's a chance maybe to fill 12, 14 dates in the summertime. And like you said, the MISL/MSL had kind of petered out and disappeared. What was left of its franchises went one of two ways. A couple of them went into the NPSL at the time, and a couple of them, then Dallas and San Diego, said, well, we're going to go into this league. Now, I know where Ron Weinstein is. I haven't had a chance to catch up with him yet. I've always wanted to hear what that sales pitch was like, telling those teams, those storied teams, hey, let's play in the summer instead of the winter where you've had lots of success. But he pulled it off and was able to find some other arena owners to come together to put together a 7-team league in 1993. And so there they were. 1993, they actually had a league, and it actually played all the way through, and they had 7 teams, and interest was pretty high because they doubled in size by the next year.
Well, we'd certainly love to find Ron Weinstein for a conversation, so we'll put a little push pin on that one and see if we can mutually figure out a way for a future episode on that. But so I guess as you became aware of it, and obviously in a more concentrated way as an actual gig for the local franchise in Indianapolis, what of soccer in the summer? Because I think it's important to remember that around this time is when obviously the World Cup was in the United States in 1994-ish, and you also had the mandate from FIFA to create or recreate a top-tier Division I professional league outdoors in the United States, which obviously didn't start until 96. But that's the backdrop of this idea, right? So the idea of doing indoor soccer in the summer made sense a lot, I guess, in the late 80s, early 90s when the idea was being formed. But, real professional outdoor soccer was also starting to, shall we say, recoalesce.
You're right. And so two things did happen, right? So when CISL launches in 93, 94, 95, they basically have the summer to themselves, and things went pretty well. I mean, the first year, they averaged just under 5,000 a game. They boosted that up to about 5,200 a game and about 5,400 a game in 95, and really had a really good year, almost 6,000 a game in 1996, going head-to-head against this new thing called Major League Soccer. So, but that was a little bit of a blow. What people didn't realize is that when the original NASL went under, all we had soccer-wise, basically, for the next 10 years or so, was the indoor game, which was to some, a hyped-up version of outdoor, very exciting, and to others was a bastardization of the game. But that was what we had, and the indoor game was very successful into the mid-'80s, and then its luster kind of faded a little bit towards the late 90s, or late 80s. So here we are, mid-1996, this new MLS has begun. Really, it's the soccer that is traditional, that people understand, and competing head-to-head. So that was the first thing that would kind of started to chip away at the CISL. And the other thing was the WNBA, which came along the next year. So all these NBA owners who, by the time 97 got around, there was a handful of them left in the CISL, went with WNBA teams as a brand extension of their NBA teams, and they found that it was a little easier to sell and something that their salespeople knew more than indoor soccer. And so it was a little easier for them to make that transition from men's basketball in the winter, women's basketball in the summer. And I think those two things really put the nail in the coffin of summer indoor soccer. And as we've seen over the last 20 years, the growth of outdoor soccer at all levels has siphoned off the best talent from indoor to where indoor soccer today is just a shell of where it was in 1996. I mean, there's nobody today who's as good a player indoors as Tattoo was or as Preki was, and those guys played as recently as in Tattoo's case 15 years ago, or maybe less, and in Preki's case played indoor 20 years ago.
Yeah, so I want to come back to that in a little bit about sort of the state of indoor soccer or the state of outdoor soccer and all that kind of stuff, because I think it's really, really true, right? What you're saying is that, and even a generation before those players that you mentioned, like the Steve Jungels of the world and the Stan Terleckis and the Freddie Gugurevs, and I mean, these are there's a point at which the best talent in soccer was playing indoors, because like you said, there really wasn't a whole lot of outdoor stuff out there that was worth pay, that could be paid for, and it was sort of, and some of these were really tremendous players, and the National Soccer Hall of Fame is in abeyance until it gets relaunched next year. But you wonder how some of the indoor game should be remembered as part of this long and torturous history of soccer, because, like I said, the best players are out there, and frankly, some of them made the transition back outdoor, like a Preki, right?
The Hall and I'm a Hall of Fame voter, the Hall and I have had this discussion before, and the new executive director of the Hall is a friend of mine, so he and I need to have this conversation again, that I think you can't tell the story of soccer in this country by ignoring indoor. Now, there are some people in the Hall of Fame who, like you said, who did play indoors, but they're in because of their outdoor accomplishments. Like, I voted for Victor Nogueira every year that he was on the ballot. He made it on the ballot because he had a substantial outdoor career, but I voted for him every year because he was probably the best indoor goalie of all time. That's just this little thing that I have. I think that there needs to be some space carved out in the actual Hall of Fame to recognize this facet of the game, which kept soccer alive in this country from 1985 till 1996 when MLS launched. And I think that for the staid traditionalists, indoor is a weird bird, because it's not enough like outdoor for outdoor people, but it's too much like outdoor for some other people. So it's always had this kind of weird niche in the middle for people who are okay with what we call human pinball. But I think, our Hall of Fame isn't telling the whole story of the history of the game in this country if it continues to ignore the stars of indoor and the great stories of indoor. And I don't know if they ever will.
Well, all right, that's another crusade that I'd love to chat with you, and maybe we'll figure out some rationale on how to sort of tackle that, because the NASL, of course, was very much, I mean, arguably that was the launch of indoor soccer back in a sort of a tournament kind of thing. So you're right, it is intertwined. I couldn't agree with you more. All right, but so let's talk about late 95, early 96, right? So it seems that 95 or in 1995, the Continental Indoor Soccer League, about 3 years under its belt, it's up to 15 teams. It breaks a bunch of records that year both on the field as well as off the field. I think Dallas had a game with the Sidekicks of over 16,000 at the Reunion Arena. And it seems that despite some bizarreness, I guess, and at the end of the season you see I think there were 4 teams that folded. This seemed like it was, they had a Prime Sports Fox TV deal. There's a car dealership sponsorship thing. It seems like it's on the up and up. And in steps, I think the only expansion franchise for 96, the previous Indianapolis Twisters. So maybe you can give us a sense of what you knew about this as it was announced, as it was launched, and what you were sort of walking into.
We were kind of learning on the fly because, like you said, yes, 95, it was this big league, 15, which was until recently the largest indoor league that had ever been. But Pittsburgh folded, Las Vegas folded, a year after winning the championship. They won it as an expansion team, and then they folded the next year. The team in Mexico City went under. You were stepping into a league that was kind of teetering a little bit. You still had some really strong franchises. Dallas was still Dallas, and they still had Tattoo, and they still had great crowd support. They were doing really good things in Washington and Sacramento and places like that. And so the Indianapolis team comes into existence. I still don't know why they did it. Again, here's another thing where the sales job. I mean, Ron Weinstein must have been a really good salesman, because he sold David and Rodney Goins, these two brothers, with only a little bit of maybe sports background. Rodney had played college soccer, and I don't think David had. But somehow they convinced them that the team in Indianapolis in the Continental Indoor Soccer League in the summer at Market Square Arena was going to do great guns. Didn't turn out that way, obviously, but I think that they thought it would. They just didn't really know how to go about it. And that's been the downfall of a lot of these kind of offshoot teams or these alternative leagues, is that people get into it with good intentions, but they really don't have their eyes open in terms of, okay, what is it going to actually take for us to be successful? And that means a lot of effort has to be put into ticket sales and marketing. So when you see a club now, just to go back outdoors for a second, Sacramento Republic FC, when they launched, they said, here's what we have to do. And they went and got people that had actual professional sports experience at a major league level who understood what it took to sell tickets and to market and to be a big league franchise and to look like, even though you were playing at that time in the third division, that you were a professional team with gravitas and it was something worth spending your discretionary dollars on. Goins has never got that. I don't think in the 2-year history of the team ever really had anyone who was selling tickets. We had people who were in charge of keeping track of tickets, and we had people who were in charge of making sure that, tickets got where they had to be, but we didn't have anybody physically selling tickets until about midway through the second year. So the first year was just you have all that expansion thing. I mean, most expansion teams are a little bit of a circus from the get-go, but then you put this pressure of, you have an inexperienced ownership group with an inexperienced front office in a league that has its ups and downs, in a market where the game hadn't really been successful, in a league playing at a weird time of year, and all these things kind of came together, and it was disaster is too strong a word, but it was really interesting. It was really touch and go there. And as you know, and anybody who knows the history of this, partway through the year, about 2/3 of the year, the league took over the team because the Goinses walked away from the team.
All right, before we get there, who are the Goins brothers?
So David and Rodney Goins were two brothers from Chicago, the Chicago area, and they were entrepreneurs. And I always liked David very much. Very nice guy. Sadly, he passed away a couple of years ago. Rodney was a former player and still thought of himself as a player, and in fact did suit up for the team, which was another one of those kind of circus elements that happened in the history of the Twisters. But they really didn't have the kind of pro sports experience that you would like to see in an ownership group, especially one that was taking over a brand new team in a market where, again, the sport was a little bit unsettled. And so they had a vision. They said all the right things. They said they were going to do X, Y, and Z. And I just really don't think that they had the kind of capitalization that you need to pull it off. And so when things didn't go as well as they thought, as they hoped, we had 5,000 for opening night, had an exciting overtime game against the Washington Warthogs, which lost in overtime. They were never able to build on that, and so there were no really great sales and marketing efforts. We didn't have a commercial. We didn't do billboards. It was not like today. You wouldn't do a soccer team today without having billboards and a serious marketing presence, but we didn't have that. So they just really, it was just a combination of inexperienced ownership and a team and a league and a product that was hard to market. So all those things combined to make things really chaotic in that summer of 1996.
Well, what was the source of, best you could tell, the source of their income, and how do you think they even kind of just stumbled into the CISL anyway? Like, why get into sports? If they're going to get into sports, why this fledgling soccer thing that's it's hard to, as you say, kind of sell because of its uniquenesses, plural?
Well, I do know that David and Rodney, they grew up all around the world. I believe their parents may have been either military or in government service, because I know that they bounced around all over in a variety of countries, and so they did get a love for the game. But they owned a company called Executive Sports Management in Chicago, which was a sports marketing company. And basically their deal was they owned and managed luxury suites, and they consulted and did corporate hospitality for a bunch of Fortune 500 companies. So they were kind of tangentially in that sports space. But that and running a team are two totally different things. I mean, people want food. If people go to a game, they want food, and they want that experience of the suite. So that's a little bit easier sell than trying to sell indoor soccer. Rodney's love for the game, he'd played briefly at Indiana University and finished at Howard University, so he was a player. And so that combination kind of, hey, we're in this sports space. Ron Weinstein has told us that there's money to be made here. They have a love for soccer. Yeah, let's do it. I can only speak to what I know from that is that that's probably the genesis of it. And I'm certain that by the summer, by August of 1996, they were regretting that decision, obviously.
Yeah, I think it's important to remember, too, that the base of owners of these teams in the CISL was basically a combination of either private ownership, right, in the case of the Goins, which is their case, and owners of either an NBA or an NHL team outright, right? So it almost seems like you've got kind of like those that know how to do this professional sports marketing game, right, with the NBA and the NHL, mixed in with others who think they can, but maybe, frankly, aren't as capable because that's not their full-time gig.
Right, agreed. I mean, Washington, they did well. Abe Pollin got it and hired a bunch of people. Mike Evans was their general manager, and the Warthogs did well and drew good crowds. Why they were one of the teams that went away, I don't know, while others survived. Jim Thomas in Sacramento, at least they had an idea. They had connections to the community, and they could leverage some of their existing infrastructure to make their indoor team more successful than it might otherwise be. And in Detroit, basically, they just gave away scads of tickets. I mean, they had basically their season paid for by the sponsorship agreement with GMC that saw them be the Detroit Neon for the first few years, and then finish up as the Detroit Safari when GMC gave them, I don't know, $1 million+. So basically, the Neon / Safari were just giving away tickets left and right. So that was their business model. But yeah, and other teams were kind of like the Goins brothers, or like in San Diego, where they weren't owned by an NBA or NHL team. Seattle was, and they had the trouble, I think, of, if you've ever been to Seattle in the summer, you'd much rather be outside much of the time than go inside. So that may have played into it as well. But yeah, so the CISL was kind of interesting hodgepodge of people with not only different backgrounds and different strengths and weaknesses. They eventually came to have a different vision of how things should go. And that led, I think, to the tensions that eventually broke up the league.
Yeah, I actually lived in Seattle in 96, 97, went to a couple of Sea Dogs games myself, Fernando Clavillo behind the bench, etc. Yes, a few thousand of us rattling around on a summer evening.
Key Arena.
Key Arena, that's right. All right, so in steps Kenn as the voice of the Twisters, right? So maybe a little background, a little fun, a little memories, if not fun, maybe just memories generally. What is it like to be the quote unquote voice of a team? You're on a relatively you're on the higher end of the AM dial. You got a show that's also beyond just the games themselves, called Twister Watch. Give me a sense of sort of how well thought out this was, or how much you had to kind of think that through as part of this adventure you were starting.
Well, we had a guy named Matt Dockstader who was kind of setting up a lot of these kind of infrastructural items, and so he hired me to be the voice of the team. Went out and got the radio deal, hired my good friend Dan Capsalis to do color, and we were a great team. We were great friends, and we hit it off really well, and we had a lot of fun. So the thing about indoor is, it's always exciting. So at least you had stuff to get excited about during the course of a broadcast. If you're doing expansion outdoor soccer team, you're going to lose a lot of 1-0, 2-0 games. Maybe that's not the most exciting thing, but at least in indoor, there's going to be lots of goals scored. So we did have a lot of fun, even though the team was struggling. We were struggling to put wins together. But yeah, so we were playing a couple 3 nights a week and traveling. We were doing all the games on the radio except the ones in Monterey. That's the reason for that we'll get to in a bit. So yeah, and and then we had a weekly kind of call-in show where we'd have people on from the team. We'd have players on. We'd have coaches on. So it was, we were giving it our best effort from the standpoint of we were on an actual radio station, which is not something necessarily that would happen today because now everything's online. And we had an actual coaches show, for lack of a better term, a call-in show once a week. And it was lots of fun. It was new for a lot of us. I mean, I had grown up watching the MISL Game of the Week on USA Network, and it was almost always Sloboda and the St. Louis Steamers and, Jungle and the New York Arrows who were on. And so getting back to that a little bit and being able to be the voice of a team was a lot of fun. And quite frankly, indoor is a lot like hockey in terms of how you call it. So having had that experience of a year of calling hockey, the transition was not as hard as it might otherwise have been. Things really did get a little wonky because crowds weren't there and money pressures got tight. And we kept hearing rumors about, are we going to make payroll or what's going to happen? And then Weinstein would come into town, have big closed-door meetings with the owners, and he would leave, and we would think that everything would be fine. And then 2 weeks later, things would start to go pear-shaped again. So it was a chaotic summer. All the while, we're trying to, get this team's footing underneath it and trying to win some games and go into places I hadn't been in a while. And so it was a lot of fun, but it was really weird at times. It's just weird to be part of the inner workings of an expansion organization that's going through the growing pains.
But it's actually a pretty big commitment, right? A brand new franchise in a still fledgling league, unproven. And here you are with a year, you got a full season long radio deal with a coach's show, if you will. And that's actually a pretty interesting and solid commitment media wise, at least. So that seems like that was a smart idea. No?
Yeah, it seemed in theory, yeah. And I've always been of the mind that there are worse ways to spend your marketing dollars than to put your games on radio and or television, because every one of those broadcasts is a 2.5, 3 hour commercial for your game and your sport. And so in that respect, they got that part right. And I don't know how many people listened, but I do know that that part of it was a pretty good outreach to the community, and that was what they were intending to do, to look big league. You couldn't really look big league unless you had some sort of a media presence. And that first year we weren't on. I don't believe we were on any of the Game of the Week broadcasts. I know we were the second year, but not everybody got Prime Network back then either. It was kind of like being tucked away on this niche cable network that not everybody got. So cable then in 1996-97 was not what it is today. So you had to pretty much listen to me if you wanted to follow the team.
And listeners to our show can indeed relive some of those episodes, because Kenn on his blog, Kenn, Kenn, don't forget the second N.com, has a page devoted to a couple of pages to the Twisters, but there's a whole page devoted to with all just about a pretty comprehensive set of broadcasts. So you can literally click on them and on any of the episodes and any of the games, and you can actually hear the voice and the enthusiasm and the perhaps a little bit of the background, I guess, maybe of the season going in interesting directions right there, literally game by game there on Kenn's websites, which I thought was really interesting, really neat, and also interesting to hear sort of the quality of the on-air broadcast kind of waning and waxing depending on how the stars and the clouds were aligned that evening with I'm assuming a wattage that sort of changed as the day changed to night.
Yeah, I don't think to be MYS, and actually all those recordings I think are recorded. I think I had them recorded back at the studio, so they would have been coming through at the time the phone lines to do that. This was before ISDN and before voice over IP and all this. So you were kind of at the mercy of the AT&T at the time, or whatever the phone company was, getting your voice from point A to point B. So yeah, here going back to being a pack rat, saving all these things. So I saved all of these cassettes, and almost all of the broadcasts survived. So I digitized them all and figured, you know what, again, maybe 3 or 4 people out there are interested, but I thought they should be preserved for posterity. So they're all out there. All the ones that I have are out there, and you can listen to all the Indiana Twisters games that exist from those 2 seasons. And yeah, we had some interesting broadcast setups as well. I mean, I borrowed the broadcasting equipment was actually borrowed from the Indianapolis Ice because the guy who succeeded me came back in as the broadcaster for the Ice. Ken Double was a friend of mine, and rather than go out and buy all of our new broadcast equipment, since we were playing in the summer and the Ice were playing in the winter, we just basically leased their broadcasting equipment. So I was at least used to the setup, and it's a pretty decent setup. But there were some nights where it just didn't work. So I remember doing an entire game in Detroit, actually speaking like I'm speaking to you on a handheld phone held up to my ears. And by the time the game was over, I couldn't unclench my hand because it had been wrapped around this phone receiver for 3 hours. So I had to pry it out of my hands. And there were other places like in Portland, I remember trying to convince an operator to reverse the charges so that we could actually get on the air because it was a West Coast game. It was very late. We couldn't get anybody in the office. And here I am. I need to get on the air, but I had to convince the operator from Portland or wherever she was to reverse the charges so that we could actually get our broadcast on the air. So, yeah, fun times in broadcasting with a nascent team.
All right, I'm not going to ask you at what point did you question your sanity. I'll get to that in a little bit later. But you alluded to it before. You had the first home game you lost to the team lost their debut game to Detroit on June 14, 1996. But a week later, you have a decent crowd, just over 5,000 at Market Square Arena, and the game was actually probably pretty fun. It looks like it was went down to the wire. Where there was a game, I guess there was an overtime goal that just a heartbreaking loss. Did it seem like did it feel like it was everything was off to a good start? It seems like, from an outsider's perspective, that you couldn't ask for a more entertaining debut.
That was the feeling. 25 seconds away from winning 6-5, the Warthogs score, and then you lose. But that's indoor. I mean, that can happen. You can go from leading with 25 seconds left to losing in overtime in a heartbeat. That's what it was. But I will tell you that the after party after that game, because everything had been building up to that night, you only get one inaugural home game in your history. And it was a good crowd. It was a good game. We thought the sky was the limit. Everybody was really optimistic, even despite the loss. So at the party afterwards, which went on till the wee hours, we were very optimistic that this is a launching point and things are going to get better from here. Little did we know that we'd lose the first four and struggle really to get any semblance of traction from the team side. But then when we started to find out that people were not coming to games, partially because we didn't really have sales and marketing efforts, but for a variety of reasons, then kind of that optimism kind of dwindled, and by the time we got to August, I mean, it was kind of you talk about the dog days in baseball. Yeah, a lot of that optimism had really gone.
Well, let's sort of the hints of that didn't take fairly long to kind of identify themselves, right? So, and again, this is more an outsider's perspective, so you probably had more of an insider's knowledge about what was going on, but. And by the way, Ken has also got some really good blow-by-blow, date-by-date history points about the first year of the Twisters as well. And I think folks who grew up or watched those games will probably remember a bunch of these. But it seems to me like the first sort of hint of questionableness, I guess if that's a word, is in July, not a month later, where Rodney Goins decides that he's going to keep his title as president, but he's going to kind of work towards joining the team as a player, and then there's a new general manager that comes in. What's that all about?
Right, and this is where it became obvious that we were struggling to draw people at the gate, and that someone had to come in here who had some semblance of an idea about how you sell and market a team. Bob Wilbur, good guy. Actually, you should get him as a guest as well. Now I think he's just written a book as well, so he's had a varied career. So he comes in, new general manager. Rodney was miscast as a general manager. What he really wanted to do was play, which he eventually did. But yeah, Bob Wilbur comes in. At least he was the grown-up in the room in terms of his experience in pro sports. Now, when you come in halfway through a season, there's very little that you can do to correct things for that season. And because those things take time, it takes time to build those relationships. It takes time to find those sponsors and to sell those tickets and, get groups together and things like that. So Bob was kind of behind the eight ball from the get-go. And so ownership, being impatient as ownership often is, it really didn't stabilize things that much. Rodney, like I said, becoming an active player kind of added to the circus atmosphere. To the players on the team, they kind of looked side eyes at this because, Rodney had scrimmaged with the team, and there's usually this demarcation that you're either team side or you're front office side, and if you try to go from one to the other, there's going to be a little bit of tension there. Rodney was not a bad player. Had he not tried to drop ship himself into the game, halfway through after it had been years since he had played outdoor soccer, that'd be one thing. But he was certainly not a difference-making player. And by the time we got into that summer and got into late July, early August, the team was actually playing a little bit better. We had some dramatic, some fun wins, but the crowds just weren't materializing, and we were starting to think that, hey, maybe the optimism that we had after game one was a little bit premature, and that things were, rumors are flying, and, like I said, Weinstein's flying in to try to have meetings and try to correct the situation. And by the time we get to late August, things just went completely pear-shaped.
Okay, friends, sorry for the interruption. Just wanted to quickly remind you that today's episode of Good Seats Still Available is brought to you by our friends at Audible, the premier provider of digital audiobooks with over 180,000 titles to choose from in just about every genre you could think of. Audible titles play on iPhone, Kindle, Android, and more than 500 devices and MP3 players for listening anytime, anywhere. And for a limited time, my audience can listen to a free download of any book that they choose, as well as get a 30-day free trial when you go to audibletrial.com/goodseats. That's audibletrial.com/goodseats. And you can choose from over 180,000 titles, as we said, including one that I'm listening to right now. It's called The 10-Gallon War by John Eisenberg. That's the story of the NFL's Cowboys, the AFL's Texans, and the feud for Dallas's pro football future. Another one on my list, which I have yet to download but is on my queue, that could be interesting to our audience here, is called The National Forgotten League by Dan Daly, entertaining stories and observations from pro football's first 50 years. Those are just two of the many thousands of titles to choose from, and not just in sports history, but you name the genre that you might want to listen to, and Audible's got it. By the way, two guests perhaps that we'll have on the show, hopefully sometime soon. But again, go to audibletrial.com/goodseats for your free 30-day trial, as well as your free audiobook download to try it out for yourself. Again, that's audibletrial.com/goodseats. And now, back to our conversation. So how are you interpreting July and August then? It looks like the Board of Governors, right, to the fact that actually has to be a thing, approves Rodney Goins becoming a player. It clearly seems to me that Wilbur couldn't immediately get stuff sort of together, or maybe he could, but recognized that he didn't have the funds and or the ownership oversight that he needed to kind of do it. So it seems like that's when the league kind of had to sort of at least start to step in with at least some thoughts. Maybe you can maybe describe kind of the by day and by night sort of existence in August, right? When you're trying to, put across the air of professionalism on air and describing a team and its successes and its travails, but behind the scenes, maybe not always knowing what's going to happen next or rumors of such.
Yeah, that's when it puts you in a weird position because, I was trained as a journalist, and so the story was, what was really going on, the tumult behind it. But as someone who's getting paid by the team to put the best face on things, you were kind of not able to, we weren't doing any frontline investigations about David and Rodney's finances at halftime of a game against the Dallas Sidekicks. So you were trying to stay positive, trying to, just stick with the game and be exciting about that. And at that point still, we'd all gotten paid as far as I know, but there started to be a point where checks, at least my checks, I can't speak to the players because the players were paid by the league, things were in arrears a bit. And so that's usually the first sign that things aren't going well when you're you're supposed to get paid and checks are delayed or whatever happened. So started to think that, hey, things were not going quite so well. And then suddenly, boom, Weinstein comes to town. They have a press conference that, everything's going to be okay. And next thing you know, a couple of weeks later, David and Rodney just pulled out completely. And then the CISL has to say, okay, we're taking over. And what they did then was, which I thought was actually a savvy move, and had this continued, this might have bode even well for us, even better for us the second year, was they brought in Roy Turner. Roy Turner had been the longtime coach of the Wichita Wings. He'd been in the front office of the Wings. He understood the indoor game inside and out as far as sales and marketing. And so for that last month, he was the general manager of the team. Roy Turner was basically with a skeleton staff running that team for the last month as they were wards of the league and as they tried to find some investor to come in and take over the team, which they eventually did. But Roy Turner was fun. Anybody who worked with Roy or was around Roy knows that Roy was fun, big personality. And so that last month was on a shoestring, would be, to say the least. We only had one home game towards the end, so they were building towards that last home game. I think the last home game, every ticket was like $5. We got 9,000 people a game. But I will tell you this one story. So David and Rodney pull out. So I'm thinking, what does this mean for me? Are they going to continue to do the broadcast? What? The team is supposed to leave on a road trip. This is late, so this is early September. So the next day, we're supposed to leave, go on a road trip. I think we were supposed to go to Dallas and Monterey. I'm sitting at home, waiting by the phone, trying to discover, should I get up in the morning and go to Indianapolis International Airport because we're going on this road trip? We're going to do the broadcast or not? Roy Turner called me up like 10 o'clock that night and said, look, the decision's been made. There will be no more radio broadcasts for the remainder of the season. So that was basically it for me for 1996. I did do public address announcing for that last game, that last home game, but in terms of broadcast history for that 96 season, that was when they pulled the plug.
So that's the end of August. Okay, and then the team basically officially suspends operations and all that, and then David and Rodney pull out. CISL takes on this in September. So, but I want to go back to a point. So you said before about people getting paid, right? Interesting point, right? The CISL paid the players as part of the league. So this was not the franchise's direct responsibility. The players were employees of the league, right? And I think this was also a bit of the novelty of the CISL in that it was single entity, which at the time was still a bit nouveau, right?
Right. And so what it was so the league actually wrote checks to players. Everything came out of the league office, I guess, which was in California. But each team had a monthly assessment. So every team had to put in, their money every month so that the league was able to pay the players. And they had A contracts and B contracts and C contracts and local player contracts. So it was basically the structure where if you had an A contract, I want to say it was like $3,000 a month, maybe $3,500 a month. And then a B contract was either $2,500, thereabouts a month. And this is all gross figures. And then a C contract less than that. And then there were some local players that you could literally pay $75 a game because they were just local guys who you'd find in your local league. And so, so there was this kind of quasi-single entity structure. It wasn't really set up, I don't think, as an LLC the way Major League Soccer is. But there were some of these elements of the league having control over paying the players and of league-wide sponsorship deals, which trickled down to everyone else. It was kind of an interesting setup there at that time. Didn't save them, obviously.
So while you're not doing the broadcast, though, you're still an employee of the team. You're doing the public address stuff.
No. I wasn't an employee of the team. So I was an independent contractor, basically. I basically had nothing to do for the last month. But then they did say, look, we're going to have this one more home game. Will you do public address announcing? I was like, okay, fine. I don't have anything else to do. That's fine. That was all I did. It wasn't like I was going into the office every day anyway. That happened in the second year when I was actually an employee and became the media relations director in addition to being the team broadcaster. But when the David Rodney pulled out and when Roy Turner called and said, we're not doing any more broadcasts for this year, that was basically it. I was done.
Got it. Okay. So, but in steps new management. So, these trucking guys, Dan and Carl Cook, come in and purchase a franchise at the tail end of September. What is your knowledge of that? And or it seems like that was the idea for the fresh start, right? New team, new team name, new logo, new everything, right? And a rebirth of the broadcasts.
Yeah, you know when I found out that the team had been sold? It was in the paper in the story about one of the road games, whatever. It's in the Indianapolis Star the next day. Twisters played the game, and here's the score. And oh, by the way, the team has been purchased by Dan and Carl Cook, and they intend to keep it and play it in '97. I was like, oh, well, that's interesting because that was the first I'd heard of it. Dan Cook, great guy. Carl is his father. So they had made their money in trucking. Shipping freight and stuff all over the country. They'd done really well. To this day, I still don't understand why. I mean, Dan really didn't have a big interest in it. I still don't understand why they did it. But thankfully for all of us who were involved, they did do it. Super great, cool owners, really kind of hands-offish in a way. Definitely not one of those, owners that comes in and tries to do stuff that they don't know how to do. They were really hands-off. So we were thinking, hey, this is great. The team is saved. There's going to be another year. But at that point, no, I had no idea. I'm on a basically day-to-day, month-to-month, at the whim of the front office, whether I'm the guy to come back the next year. So I had left local television at that point. I was working at a bank in the off season, and I was hoping, like everybody else, just going, when you're not in it, the off season with the CISL having a short season playing in the summer, from October till the next June, that's a long off season, man, especially when you're not sure what's going to happen. I was waiting to find out, like everyone else, exactly what their plans were. And luckily for me, they decided, yes, we are going to do, we're going to do the same thing broadcast-wise that we did in '96 and '97, same radio station. Luckily, me as the incumbent, that helped. It wasn't like there were a lot of people beating down their door to be the broadcaster of the Twisters, and so we were able to do it all again in 1997. And things were way better, but things were also comical / circus-like fun, but at least you weren't really worried from day to day whether the team was going to fold.
All right. When did you sort of see '97 being sort of the beginning of a new beginning and maybe the beginning of the end? Because it seems like the league itself was having issues too, not just a stabilized franchise in now the newly renamed Indiana Twisters.
Right. Well, as things progressed over the off season, I was waiting to hear what was going to happen, and it wasn't until I guess late in the spring that they made the decision that they were going to be back on WMYS and we were going to do broadcasts, and I was going to be involved and all that. Yeah. So the Arizona Sand Sharks had got new owners, and so they'd sat out in 1996, but they were coming back in 1997. And then right on the eve of the '97 season, the San Diego Sockers went dark, which what they said was a hiatus. As it turned out, that was the end of the original version of the San Diego Sockers. So we start the season. Things are going much better. We felt better about things. Things were much more professionally run. We moved to new offices. We had things going on. It felt a lot better. Team struggled a little bit out of the gates, but then really caught fire. And then about midway through, maybe not quite midway through the season, again, the crowds were not materializing. We were not getting people to come out to games. And again, this goes back to not having robust sales and marketing efforts and really not having people in the front office who were working day to day every day, 8 to 10 hours a day trying to sell tickets. It was basically, well, we'll throw open the doors and hope that somebody shows up, which they did not. So Dan Cook and Kim Cook, his wife, who's also a great owner, super lady, they had to cut ties with the general manager that they had hired. They had hired a family friend I think his actual business was selling farm implements. I think that was his line of work. And he was like a part-time basketball scout or something. But anyway, had no idea how to run a professional sports franchise. Zero idea. And so they fired him and brought in a guy named Brad Berry, who I knew because he'd worked for the Indianapolis Ice when I was doing their games, and he understood. He understood that this is about ticket sales first and foremost. And so when he came in, took over as a general manager, we became a much more professional outfit. But by that point, again, you got to have long lead time for these things. And so Brad was able to come in and do good things so that we were able to get more revenue in the door and to make the outlook a bit brighter. But meanwhile, the league was falling apart. And that goes back to, again, this kind of disconnect between the goals of some owners versus the goals of some other owners versus the goals of the commissioner. And so CISL was not at all well capped by the time it got to September of '97.
How did that evidence itself to you as you were going around the league? And it seemed like the Indiana situation would stabilize a bit, and quite a bit, frankly, from the year before. But When did you kind of know the things, or was it a surprise? Because I think there are some people, depending on who you ask, at the end of the 97 season, or actually the end of the year of 97, when the league folded and then sort of the diaspora went on to the WISL and the Premier Soccer Alliance and the remnants of such. When did you know it was sort of kind of falling apart and or maybe on its last legs?
You start to hear, I mean, everybody talks to everybody else, right? So as you'd go around the league, you'd be talking to your counterparts. I'd be talking to other broadcasters. Hey, did you hear about this? There was always, if you've been in indoor soccer for any length of time at all, there's always rumors, hey, there's going to be a new team in insert city here. Hey, there's going to be a new team in Boston. There's going to be this. Oh, I heard this team is going to move to this place. Detroit had been a disaster. I mean, they were one of the worst teams that year in the history of the indoor game. And so, you could see they're announcing 10,000 and there's maybe 2,500 people there because they were giving away scads of tickets, and they had a horrible team. Arizona wasn't doing great shakes under new ownership, and they weren't, just crowds were kind of downish around the league. And so it wasn't really anything where we said, oh, this is a dead man walking. We just felt like, okay, there are some trouble spots here, and people are talking, but people talk all the time. So as we went around and around to places, you'd talk to your counterparts, but we were so caught up in the fact that, by this point, the Twisters themselves are playing really, really well, and we really had a chance to maybe win a championship. So all those other things were not first and foremost on our minds. It was like, hey, we've got an exciting team that's playing really well, and lots of fun things are happening. And the money problems were someone else's responsibility at that point, even though they were going to directly affect all of us. We weren't. That wasn't our primary concern.
So quickly, let's talk about the play though that you saw for the 2 years, both the team as well as the league, because it seems like it was a hell of a lot of fun, and it seems like it was marketed as an experience, as an entertaining opportunity. It was a soccer, of course, indoor style, but the music and the announcements, and it seemed like some of those maybe breakthrough ideas or presentation concepts from the old MISL really took on sort of new life. If you look at some of the videos of these games, it seems like it was a family entertainment experience, or at least tried to be marketed as such.
Yep, you're exactly right. And they had adapted many of the things that had made the original MISL successful. And it helped, too, that, there were a lot of great indoor soccer players still in the CISL at that point because they hadn't gone outdoors. We still had Tattoo, who's one of the great players of all time, but guys like Zizinho and David Doyle and Marco Lopez and Mark Thomas and Dale Irvine, who's my all-time favorite player. I mean, we had really good players in the league, and so the quality of play was very high. It was very exciting. It was a lot of fun. And so it was a good product that they were putting out on the floor. It was just a weird time of year to try to do it. And then when the WNBA came into being and owners saw, hey, maybe we can do a little bit better with women's basketball in the summer than with this indoor soccer game that's pretty chaotic, maybe we'll devote our energies in that area. And so a lot of them did do that. But the quality of play was very high. A lot of players ended up actually playing. They would play year round because, again, if you play in the summer and then the NPSL was playing in the winter, I knew a lot of guys who went back and forth. Probably took a couple years off the end of their lives or didn't help them injury-wise, but they were able to make paychecks from two different leagues over the course of a year. So in that respect, it was a really high quality of play, maybe even better than the NPSL at that time, but at least comparable.
And it seems like, though, that the direction of the league was torn apart by those who were the sort of pros in the arena ownership and other major league ownership teams, and those that were not. Is that a correct assessment, or were there other things underlying too, do you think?
I think that's part of it. The other thing that I heard a lot, and didn't hear this until right at the end when the actual split happened, when the Sidekicks pulled out, and I want to say that was about close to Christmas of '97, was that, hey, Ron Weinstein's the only guy making money at this thing. And that was because he had a codicil in his employment contract that he would get a piece of any expansion fee, which makes sense in some respect. I mean, a lot of the expansion fees obviously would be dispersed around the league, and so the commissioner getting a piece of it, that's fine. But the commissioner didn't have to run a team and actually, expend money to run a team. So he was getting a slice of expansion fees as well. So if I incentivized you, Tim, to get a piece of expansion teams, what would you do? you'd bring in a lot of expansion teams. That's exactly what they did. And so the thought among several owners in the league was, hey, Weinstein's the only guy, he's making out like a bandit on this deal, and here we are losing lots of money every year. This is not the way to go. And so I think that contributed to them just throwing in the towel. And once Dallas pulled out, I mean, Dallas was the first. I mean, that was you pulled the plug on them, and they pulled out of the league. A lot of other people said, well, if Dallas is out, then we'll just be out too. And that was really the end of the CISL.
Did Dallas, as far as you know, did Dallas leave with intention to go to this sort of other league, this Premier Soccer Alliance alternative, or did they go out and then somehow come back with these other somewhat like-minded owners to form the PSA?
Right. As far as I know, they pulled out, but they were not intending to go dark. They wanted the Dallas Sidekicks to continue, and so there was this faction of, Dallas was an influential franchise with, lots of connections, and they had their history, and Gordon Jago was a very hardworking person and a very charismatic person. And so as I read it at the time, when they pulled out near Christmas of '97, their intention was always to start another league and take with them whoever had shared their vision and whoever was able to, wanted to go and continue to play with the changes that they wanted to make. So they were able to get San Diego to come. Oh, no, I'm getting ahead of myself here. Actually, that first year of the PSA in '98 was kind of like a skeleton season, kind of like if you remember the test season that Arena Football had, where they only had 4 teams and they kind of went around to neutral sites. So Dallas and Sacramento were basically the 2 strongest teams that year. They were able to convince Arizona to come with them and Portland to come with them as well to make that 4-team league in '98. But my sense was that they always intended to continue on. They just didn't want to play under the CISL masthead anymore.
And it seems like the Twisters were never going to be part of any of those conversations, despite, though, doing pretty well, getting into the playoffs and in a heartbreaking fashion, losing in a mini game in early October. Again, arguably some stabilization of the franchise. It almost feels like, and again, this is sort of hindsight, right? That, if there had been something called the CISL in the following year, that perhaps Indiana would be back again. Is that a fair assessment, or is that naive?
It's very possible. Here's what happened. So I'll tell you as it went down even before that. So to go back to that mini game, the interesting part was, okay, so the team finishes 17-11, finishes second in the Eastern Division, got home field advantage for the first round of the playoffs against Houston. Unfortunately, Market Square Arena, which was a great arena for indoor soccer and for hockey, that was the time when hockey season was getting ready to start. So that Saturday, when we would have been playing at home, we would have played the first game in Houston on Friday, would have played the second game and the potential mini game at home on Saturday. Saturday was booked because the Indianapolis Ice had the arena. So we had 2 choices. So our general manager, Brad Beery, had 2 choices. Either play on the Sunday, play in Friday or Saturday in Houston, come back and play in Indiana on Sunday evening, I guess, and have that mini game and have an actual home field advantage and potentially draw a not great crowd on a Sunday evening, or give up home field advantage, play on the Friday, get a better crowd, but have to go on the road for a potential second game and potential mini game. Now, that was my first at that point I'm thinking, well, you worked all year to get home field advantage. Why would you give that up? But as Brad explained it, they were hemorrhaging money at that point. So the chance to get a decent crowd outweighed the competitive advantage issues. Now, here's the thing. On that Friday night game, there was no reason that the Twisters should have lost that game. Should have won that game, but there was no reason they should have won in Houston the next night, and they certainly did, forcing that mini game. And because this team was the best conditioned team in the league, I was just certain. There was no question in my mind they were going to win the mini game because this is what they'd been training for and training hard for all year, and it didn't work out. Mariano Balela blew out his knee, ended up losing in the mini game, and that was the end of the '97 season for the Twisters. So fast forward like a week. By that point, again, I'm an actual front office employee, media relations director, and broadcaster. The broadcast is over. They called me in and sat me down and said to a lot of us that day, look, it's a long off season. I don't have anything for you to do. I don't know what the future is, so we're going to have to let you go. So that was the end of my tenure there. But at that point, it looked to all intentions like there was going to be a next year somewhere for the Twisters. I had heard that they'd lost $1 million that year, just in the 1 year of ownership. So that's not something that you would necessarily want to repeat. But I think when the league itself fell apart, it maybe gave the cooks an out to say, maybe we won't do this. Maybe we won't go forward, or maybe we'll find someone willing to take this off our hands, which they actually did. It didn't work out, but as you know, there was an intent to play another season of the Indiana Twisters. It just didn't work out.
Well, why were the playoff games? Why was it going into October? Right? Wasn't this originally supposed to be a summer league, and now you're starting to bleed into the competition that the original owners kind of wanted to avoid?
Yeah, it had a little creep here because the season stayed the same length, 28 games. It was always 28-game seasons, but they started to the playoffs as you got more and more teams in them. Obviously, they started to creep a little bit. Like, I mean, the finals the first year in '93 were in the very beginning of October. Game 3 was on October 3rd, 1993. By the time we got to '97, the playoffs had been expanded, and so there were more teams in, and they were going, best of 2 with the minigame being the third game. And so by the time we got to the end of the '97 season, we're looking at getting into mid-October, and by the time Seattle beat Houston in the finals, it was October 19th. So things had crept pretty far away from the original, a couple of weeks from the original idea, which was summertime soccer. Now you're getting into a part of the year where you're going to have conflicts with hockey, and you're going to have trouble getting dates and things like that. So things got a little bit weird there.
Okay, so the assets of the team get purchased, and I'm guessing that that also helped you along as well as the A League and outdoor and Indiana sort of continued to kind of sort of re-energize and grow. Maybe a little bit of a postmortem on the team, and sort of then the path that you took afterwards, and continuing somehow in this wacky world of soccer despite this experience.
Well, the end of the Twisters really can be summed up this way. Losing Houston on that playoff game, I think our flight out the next day wasn't until like 6 o'clock. We couldn't get a flight out of Houston till like the following night, maybe 5, 6 o'clock in the evening. One of our players and I started drinking at like 10 o'clock the next morning. Now, anyone who knows me, I don't drink anymore, but I was never a big drinker. But this guy started at 10 a.m. I was out by like 10:30, 10:45. He kept drinking. By the time we got to the airport, was completely blitzed. And so he gets on the plane, he's blitzed. He's being belligerent. He's just being what he thought was playful, but was really overbearing on the plane. This was the first and only time in all my years of flying that I've ever actually seen authorities come onto an airplane and physically remove someone. It wasn't like they dragged the guy off like happened earlier this year, unfortunately, on an airliner. But the police did come and escorted this player off the flight. One of the other players said, "Well, I'm not going to let him, sit here overnight in jail by himself." So he got off the plane as well. So they sat in Houston overnight and flew back home the next day. And meanwhile, everyone else, including our head coach, just kind of sat and chuckled about it. And I was thinking, this kind of sums things up, doesn't it? Here we are, just lost in the playoffs. One of our better players getting thrown off the airline on the way home. What the heck else can happen here? And as we come to find out, that was the last act, actually, of the Indiana Twisters.
But it didn't swear you off of the sport of soccer, because you stayed involved, right? You did other broadcast work.
So what's weird is, at the time that we get to that '97 season, an outdoor team had launched in Indianapolis in what was then the D3 Pro League, the third division, the Indiana Blast. So being one of the few people in town, again, with any kind of soccer background at all in terms of working in a front office, kind of fell into doing media relations for them as well. Get to the end of '97, their owner pulls out. So they get purchased by a new owner, a guy named Alex Morris, who owned a third-party administrative insurance company in town. He buys the team. And then somehow over the winter, I think he was friends with the Cooks as well. I think they were pretty good friends. Somehow Dan Cook convinced him to take over the assets of what was left of the carcass of the Indiana Twisters, with the intention of then putting them into the NPSL in '98, '99. And that didn't come to fruition, because in '98, Alex Morris lost his shirt with his outdoor team. And so there just weren't the funds to run the dream of an outdoor team all winter or all summer and an indoor team in the winter that would have shared, front office and would have shared some of the players. The players were looking forward to being able to stay in one place and play for two teams, and it didn't happen. And I'll give you an interesting thing here too, Tim. When the team was going to come back, it wasn't going to be the Twisters, and here's why. Have you ever played foosball?
Sure, of course.
Okay, so some of the foosball tables. There was one of the brands of foosball tables had a big, I think it was called a tornado. So it had a big T in the middle, had a soccer ball on it, and it had what looked like wind going around it, kind of in a tornado-like thing. Well, they actually sent us a cease and desist order because they didn't want us. Our logo at that time was soccer ball around a kind of a vortex of a tornado-ish type thing. And they said it was too similar, causing confusion in the marketplace. So had Indiana come back into the NPSL in 1998, we were going to be the Indiana Vortex. And not a lot of people know that, but that was the plan, and that was the reason why, because the makers of the foosball table thought that our logo was too close to their logo, and so they were going to fight us in court over it.
That's interesting because I wonder. I think I remember what that logo looked like, and it hauntingly reminds me of the old Dallas Tornado NASL logo, which they must have purchased or gotten out of receivership or something, and maybe try to then leverage going forward. Interesting. Yeah,
it was similar. I mean, there's only so many things you can do with now how the name Twisters came about. Why? Because they had to name the team contest, and right at that point, that movie Twister was big in '96, so we kind of tied into that. So so that's how the team got named. I don't know who designed the logo. I don't know how that turned about, but yeah, as you look at it, the first year, so it does have that kind of vortex. It was red and black the first year. By the second year, when we had green and purple as colors, it was a little bit different. But yeah, it was basically that kind of vortexy, tornado-ish type logo.
All right, a couple of things to wrap up, and I appreciate you're spending so much time on this, but this is good. This is fun to sort of not only reminisce, but also to maybe sort of keep these sort of in the history books, right? Because these are things that that need to be, I think, remembered, and we all learn from what happened in the past. We think those who ignore it, of course, are doomed to failure. But we try to sort of memorialize these things, but it's interesting to me though that there's a whole bunch of things that sort of seem very thematic in these things, right? We hear about sort of owners that sort of come and go, and their sort of rationale for why they get involved in the first place, despite not having any pronounced background or any qualifications, it seems. So that seems to be a theme. The tenuousness of franchises and making payroll and the processes of such. But I'm also surprised that you would not have sworn off the sport of soccer, or perhaps there had been something that you just felt was so strong and worthwhile to continue to pursue, because you obviously continued to do so. When you moved to Chicago, the Chicago Fire, obviously, you have many people in the Chicago area remember you from the broadcast back in the mid and late 2000s, and the reincarnation of the MISL again, MISL 2, with the Chicago Storm for 2 years, where you were the broadcast voice of. How did you not renounce yourself from it, or what got into your system to say, I'm going to keep doing this?
Well, when you fall in love with the game when you're 12, 13 years old, it's not something that you give up on easily. So the game itself, I've always been in love with, but I also loved calling games. And if someone was going to have a team and someone was going to put on games and they were going to need a broadcaster, I wanted to be the guy who did those games. And so when I eventually moved from Indianapolis to Chicago, I had known the people in the front office of the Fire, Peter Wilt and Steve Pastorino, because in Indiana and back then we had kind of a loose affiliation, not like it is today, but we were kind of the affiliate of the Chicago Fire. So I knew them from that. They knew me, so I was able to fall into doing some public address announcing for them, and then that led to doing some radio, and that led to those last few years doing the television on Comcast Sportsnet Chicago as well for the last 3 years, 05 to 07. But along that same time, the MISL, as indoor soccer has always done, we feel we've got to have a team in Chicago. Probably had more teams in Chicago than any other city in the country has had an indoor team. And so that came to be in the summer of 2004. And a friend of mine was their PR director, so I had an in there and ended up doing those games. So from 04 to 06, I was doing indoor in the MISL with the Storm, and then going straight to outdoor with the Fire, and then back into indoor, and then back into outdoor. And so that was a lot of fun. And I just never wanted to really stop broadcasting the game or being around the game. And so after the Fire, I moved to Arizona for family reasons, and I still had my hand in the game. I did some Big Ten Network soccer on television, did the USL Game of the Week in 2011, and did a handful of games for the local team here a few years back. But for the most part, I haven't done any broadcasting in about 5 years, and I'm totally okay with that. It's just one of those things that ran its course. It was fun. I love talking about it. I love the relationships that I made over those years. But it's a young person's game now, so it's best left to those folks.
What about your take on soccer, right? Because soccer is one of those interesting sports that has had a very torturous history professionally in this country. Probably is the most, proliferated number of leagues and teams and acronyms and whatnot, and arguably the reason I sort of got involved and interested in this sort of subtopic in the first place. But, indoor soccer, right, is clearly a shell of its former self, maybe for some of the reasons we discussed otherwise, or maybe not. I kind of sort of saw that. I remember going to the first Chicago Storm game, actually, sitting next to the former owner of the old Chicago Sting, Lee Stern. And it didn't, it felt reminiscent, but then in many cases it felt like, this ain't what it used to be. But I'm just curious as to your take, because you've been in the trenches in some of these fledgling leagues and the stories behind them about what you sort of see the future of, if there is a future, of the indoor game, as well as now what seems to be a fledgling, although somewhat fractionalizing politically, outdoor game in this country. You have a pretty good unique view, I guess, on all that, I suspect.
Well, in terms of, the other thing is that I'm a historian of the game, actually, and so you could take a long view of this. You see that, like you said, this country and its relationship with soccer has been tortured, to say the least, ups and downs. We're in a golden era now. There's never been more interest. There's never been more stability. Even though below the surface there's a lot of drama and Sturm and Drang going on. But in terms of indoor, you're looking at that first game in 2004 and saying, this is not what it used to be. It was really good then compared to what it is now. Any player who, there are only a handful of indoor players like an Ian Bennett or a couple of other guys who are really skilled indoor players. The others are just kind of whoever teams can find, because there's no money in the indoor game at all. I mean, there's nobody drawing great crowds. Sonora does pretty well down in Mexico in terms of drawing crowds, but a lot of it is just what I call subsistence farming. And so you're just not going to get, robust front offices and great players and robust crowds like we had back in the 80s. So I always call indoor soccer the cockroach. There's just nothing seems to be able to kill it, but it is nothing like it used to be, even back in the early 2000s. I think there's always going to be indoor soccer. It's just a matter of what it'll look like. This shifting cast of teams and cities and leagues and alphabets, I think, is just going to be the state of the game going forward, the way it is. In terms of the outdoor game, like I said, this is a golden era. We've got stability. We don't have what we had in the 80s with, you never knew quite sure if your local NASL team was going to be around, because, and this common denominator that you touched on in terms of ownership commitment, it takes an owner to realize that this is going to be hard and this is going to be money lost over a period of several years. Whereas Phil Woosnam back in the NASL days sold guys on, hey, you're going to be able to make money. Soccer is booming in this country. This is going to be amazing. It's going to be great. And when, you didn't make money the first couple of years, they had no patience for it. And so they would pull out. And that still happens a bit today. And that's been a problem with indoor. People get in with good intentions, or they get sold a bill of goods, or they're over optimistic about their financial prospects. And when it doesn't come to fruition right away, they panic, and that's the end of the club. It's a disposable kind of asset. In terms of what's going on in outdoor right now, a lot of it hinges on this court decision and whether the appeal by the NASL upsets the apple cart here in mid-December. Again, here we are coming to the end of the year with uncertainty about what the landscape's going to look like in 2018, and it hinges on something that has nothing to do with the 11 players on a side on a team. So I think that's just the history of the game in this country. That's what it's always been, and that may be what it is, at least to some extent, on a lot of levels going forward.
I think the one thing, though, going forward that's really, well, two things, frankly. I think one obviously is media, although media is going through its own conniptions, right? So the idea of television rights, sort of funding everything may not necessarily be the sort of golden goose either, but it's this sort of thing of real estate, right? I mean, you see a lot of the discussions around, is Nashville back in the lead, or what of Miami and MLS and all those kinds of things? A lot of it seems to sort of circle around, or the announcement just last week, you probably read about this Sterling Bay, this construction and real estate company proposing, as either part of their pitch for the Amazon second headquarters or even independent of it, a 20,000 seat soccer stadium at the old Finkel factory here in Chicago. In the face of a fact that there's actually an MLS team that has a stadium in Bridgeview, right, with a USL team to supposedly fill that, right? So it almost feels like that the business machinations of real estate are almost kind of, and maybe to a positive extent, right? Because you could make the argument that, there are lots of these smaller arenas now that didn't exist back, 10, 15, 20 years ago. And there are dates to fill. I don't know. It just seems to be a trend that it's becoming that's not only evolving, but maybe uniquely around soccer going forward in this country, for good or for worse.
The Chicago thing that kind of blew my mind, because the first thing I said was, wow, someone's actually able to get a stadium built in the city of Chicago. And that's
right.
I mean, the whole reason that the Fire are in Bridgeview and have been since 2006 is because the city of Chicago was not interested in having a soccer stadium, or no one was able to jump through the hoops to make it happen. So I said, A, somebody's able to get a soccer stadium built in Chicago. B, it's going to seat 20,000 for a USL team. That seems really ambitious, and it seems like it was on a valuable plot of land. And then to come to find out, someone pointed out to me the tie, because I had heard about the potential Amazon and the / stadium deal. Because here in Phoenix, they're bidding for the Amazon. I mean, everybody's bidding to try to get Amazon second headquarters anyway. But a real estate deal is always going to be an easier sell than a pro sports franchise, because you can entice people with big money to understand. They understand land. They understand development. They understand, those kind of things much more than they understand what you have to do to sell, group sales to a game on a Saturday in July or August. So if you can speak to them in terms of, hey, we're going to make this land deal, this real estate deal, we're going to build here. It's always going to be a mixed use thing. There's going to be retail, and there's going to be hotels and shops. Every one of these things that you see nowadays, when they talk about a new stadium, it's always all the development that's going to happen, A, because of it or in conjunction with it. There was supposed to be a whole bunch of stuff happening in Bridgeview, too, around Toyota Park. I don't think any of that, I haven't been there in a while, but I don't think any of that has really cropped up, has it?
No, nothing of significance. Not even an L track.
The people in Bridgeview have gotten screwed left and right on taxes because their municipality opted to pay the freight for the whole stadium. See, stadium deals it's a tough business, man. That's why I'm cautiously keeping an eye on these developments in Chicago, because that seems like a real outlier to me. That seems like if they can pull that off, that will really be something different than I've seen before in the history of following this game.
And last question: how about in Phoenix? Now you're in the I think in the Phoenix metro area. Have you gotten any of the sort of pangs to get sort of clamor back into the USL and/or potentially the march to MLS with them, or are you just sort of okay just being a fan and/or an enthusiast?
Oh, in terms of me, myself, I'm not really, I've made no efforts in that regard. I mean, we finally have a decent organization here. The first couple of owners of, Reborn Outdoor Game here in Phoenix did most everything wrong. This new ownership has done almost everything right. I go to games with my son. They've got their own stadium. It's in a great location. It's a, decent quality of soccer. It's a fun night out. In terms of whether they're going to be one of the two that are supposed to be named by the end of the year, I wouldn't imagine that they're a slam dunk. But this is an attractive metro area with a large population and favorable demographics, and an ownership group with money and already has the land and could start putting shovels in the ground to upgrade their stadium the day after they were announced. So I don't say it's impossible for it to happen, for Phoenix to be an MLS side in the coming years. I don't think they're one of the top 2 or 3 favorites, but with everything that I've seen in this game over the last 40 years that I've been following it, nothing surprises me anymore.
All right. Well, Ken, this has been a surprisingly fun and interesting conversation. And actually shouldn't be surprising. I knew this was going to be interesting, but I learned some things, as I always do. And where can other people learn all that you've accumulated in your historian role? That you've got the website. You want to kind of talk about sort of a little bit what you've done with that and how you have digitized your pack ratness online.
We're coining a lot of words here today.
I am. I'm good at it, and sometimes not good at it.
Yeah, Kenn.com, KENN.com is just a place to basically put all this stuff that I don't have any other place to go that maybe nobody else is interested in, but maybe people who would listen to the show would be interested in. So if you go to KENN.com, I mean, kind of one of my things is attendance figures. So I keep track historically of as many leagues I've been able to find and through attendance figures, because I think those things should be written down somewhere. And like you said, video clips, audio clips, and other things that just strike my fancy from time to time. It's not something I make money off of. It's not something I sell advertising on. It's just basically a place to hang stuff out, the public bulletin board, and if anybody wants to check it out, they can do that, and I'm grateful for anybody who does. But sometimes some of this stuff, like I say, interests just me, or maybe now you, or maybe some of the listeners of your show, and that's a good thing, because I don't think we should lose this history, because it's fun and it's interesting, and like you say, it keeps drawing us back in no matter what we do.
I agree. I think you undersold it. There's just a chock full of data and fun stuff in there that I think, frankly, is one of the only places where some of these nooks and crannies of various soccer histories exist. So you are to be commended. And I hope that, as you mentioned earlier about your relationship with the folks at the National Soccer Hall of Fame, I actually very much agree and underline your beliefs that the indoor game should absolutely be not only remembered, but a very strong part of the history and the undercurrent of the celebration of soccer in this country. And you've lived it, and that kind of stuff is important, and that's partially why we do this show. So we and I thank you tremendously for going down memory lane with us to do that.
Oh, it was great fun, Tim. I appreciate you having me on, and I will continue to be a fan of the show and listen to other things that transpire. Because, like you said, I mean, these, I'm showing my age, but these kids today, they don't really have an idea of kind of the fun stuff that happened back in the day. I know you've had my friend Andy Crossley on. I mean, here's another guy who, just loves these short-lived and alternative things that would be lost otherwise. And I think that it's just important that we don't let these things just fade into the ether to where no one ever hears about them again.
You see, there you go. There's another interesting and fun conversation. I always learn something in these chats, and this is no exception. The CISL is something I have passing awareness of, and this being a pretty big soccer fan and an interested party in the pro game over the years. Even have gone to a couple of CISL games in Seattle back in the day. But to know the stories behind its inception, the rationale underneath it, the day-to-day running and the shenanigans of it, the demise that befell it. These are all interesting sort of parts of the tableau, in this case of American professional soccer, hopefully to be remembered and lastingly so in the relaunched National Soccer Hall of Fame in Frisco, Texas, coming to you, I believe, sometime next year once the construction is finished. And hopefully Ken and I and some others will be helpful in trying to make sure that the indoor game in all its various flavors is remembered in its important way in the telling of that story. So Ken, as you can tell, obviously is a wealth of soccer and pro sports knowledge, and you can benefit from such by going to his website early and often. That's Kenn.com. That's KENN, 2 N's.com. And he does it for fun. We do this for fun. If you enjoy this kind of thing, I think you will find Ken's website to be a treasure trove. And don't blame me if you find yourself wasting more than a few hours of time. Especially interestingly, the Twisters radio broadcasts. literally the entire 1996 season, at least until the team's backers pulled out, and the entirety of the 1997 season, including those playoff games against the Houston Hotshots, are there for listening. And it's a fun stuff. It's a trip through nostalgia. It wasn't all that long ago, frankly, but it's a great testament to and a real understanding of what was going on in those days. And if you grew up in Indianapolis, or you were a CISL fan, or just an indoor soccer intriguist, if that's a word, if you somehow stumble across the sport and you're new to it and you want to go back and see what was going on back in the day in the 90s, it's a great way to do it. Again, Kenn.com, KENN.com. And again, our thanks to Kenn Tomasch, our guest for today's episode, and a fun one. And hopefully we'll get a few more folks from the CISL in its existence on the show. Ron Weinstein, we know, is still out there and with us, and a few other folks indeed. So hopefully we'll get to some of those folks in the months to come in future episodes. Let's see. For us, goodseatsstillavailable.com. That's our website. That's the place that you can get old episodes of the show, download. You can share them with your friends. You can find out what's going on with the show. Obviously, you can click into all the various media and books and movies and things that people have published or have created, and one click away will get you to those as well. And you also find, of course, our social media presences there too. Quick links to that. But if you don't want to do that, you can just go directly to Twitter, and you'll find us there at Good Seats Still. If you want to go to Instagram, you'll find us there at Good Seats Still Available. And on Facebook, you can like us there as well. Again, thank you so much for listening. And of course, we want to thank our friends at Podfly Productions for putting this monstrosity together every week. Despite their efforts to avoid me, they do a tremendous job in putting all these pieces together. And we can't thank Corey Coates, Jerry Payne, Eric Begay, and David Gregerson, and the entire team at Podfly Productions enough. And that's podfly.net. And again, if you're thinking about doing your own podcast or need some help, give them a try. I think you will indeed enjoy and love their services. Podfly.net. That's Podfly Productions. Thank you, guys. Tip of the hat to you, and tip of the hat to you, the listener. Thank you for joining us, and we'll talk to you in your earbuds sometime next week with another fun-filled show. Thanks for listening. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.